Marie's story wasn't what it seemed. From the outside, her life looked like that of any other teenager: school, a part-time job, and a quiet home. But behind the closed doors of her house, a dark secret was growing. It was a secret so horrifying that it would push her to commit a shocking act that no one saw coming. How does a young girl go from being scared and silent to making a choice that changes everything? This is the chilling story of fear, betrayal, and a family's darkest truths. Marie was an ordinary 17-year-old girl living in a small, uneventful town. On the surface, her life appeared typical. She juggled school, a part-time job at the local diner, and occasional outings with her friends. But life at home was far from normal. Her relationship with her mother, Diane, was strained to the point of breaking. Diane was a controlling woman, her sharp tongue quick to lash out at any perceived flaw. She rarely showed affection, and when she did, it felt forced, almost mechanical. Marie had grown used to keeping her thoughts to herself, afraid that expressing them would only invite criticism. 2 years earlier, Diane had married Richard, a man she described as charming and dependable. Initially, Richard lived up to the image Diane painted of him. He was polite, hard-working, and seemed genuinely interested in building a bond with Marie. For a brief moment, Marie thought her life might improve. But as time passed, Richard's charm began to feel more like a mask, slipping away to reveal something unsettling beneath. At first, it was subtle. Richard would compliment her outfits, calling her beautiful in a way that didn't seem fatherly. His gaze lingered a little too long during conversations, and his laughter carried an undertone she couldn't quite place. Marie tried to convince herself she was imagining things. Maybe he was just trying to be nice. Maybe she was overreacting. Her doubts turned to certainty one evening when Diane was working late. Marie was sitting in the living room, her textbooks spread out on the coffee table, when Richard walked in and sat uncomfortably close to her. She could smell the faint scent of alcohol on his breath. At first, he made casual conversation, asking about her classes and her friends. But then his tone shifted. He leaned in and asked her something that made her blood run cold: a proposition for a one-night stand. Marie froze, unable to process what she'd just heard. Her heart raced as her mind scrambled for a response. Richard smiled at her, as if daring her to react. Without saying a word, she bolted to her room and locked the door. She sat on the bed, shaking, her thoughts a chaotic swirl of fear, anger, and disbelief. That night, she barely slept. She replayed the scene over and over, questioning what she had done to invite such behavior. Deep down, she knew the answer: nothing. It wasn't her fault. But the thought of telling Diane filled her with dread. Her mother wasn't the type to listen or believe her without judgment. She could already imagine Diane accusing her of lying, of trying to cause trouble in their household. Marie decided to keep the incident to herself, hoping it was a one-time lapse in judgment. She told herself she just needed to avoid being alone with Richard. But in the pit of her stomach, she knew this was only the beginning. Marie's life took a darker turn after that night. Richard's behavior didn't stop, it grew bolder. He began finding excuses to be near her, hovering in her space, as though testing her boundaries. His compliments, once subtle, became overtly suggestive. He would comment on her body or her clothes, always with a smirk that made her skin crawl. Marie tried to brush him off, responding with curt nods or walking away, but it only seemed to embolden him. The fear she felt at home started bleeding into every part of her life. At school, her grades began to slip, and her friends noticed how distant she'd become. At work, she would linger long after her shifts ended, finding comfort in the busy atmosphere of the diner. She even started volunteering for extra hours, anything to keep her away from home. But no matter how hard she tried, she couldn't avoid Richard forever. One afternoon, while she was in her room studying, she returned from a brief bathroom break to find a note on her desk. The sight of it made her stomach churn. In Richard's scrawled handwriting, the message read, "We can keep this our little secret." Her hands trembled as she tore the note into tiny pieces and flushed them down the toilet. The implication was clear: Richard wasn't going to stop, and now he was taunting her. Marie thought about telling someone, anyone, about what was happening. But every time she worked up the courage, doubt and fear silenced her. She thought of her mother's cold, judgmental gaze and the cruel words she might say. Diane was not the type to support her. She was the type to dismiss her, to accuse her of lying for attention. And then there was the town itself, small and suffocating. Gossip traveled faster than the wind, and the thought of everyone knowing her private torment was unbearable. Over the following weeks, Richard escalated. He would brush against her in narrow hallways, his touch lingering just long enough to make her heart pound with dread. He would block her path in the kitchen, leaning in too close while pretending to reach for something. Each interaction left her feeling smaller, more trapped. Marie began documenting everything in a journal, a timeline of every inappropriate comment, every unsettling touch, every moment of fear. She didn't know exactly why she did it. Maybe it was a way to make sense of what was happening, or maybe it was her way of holding on to a sliver of control. She hid the journal under her mattress, terrified that Richard or Diane might find it. Then came the night that pushed her to the edge. Diane was working late, and Richard cornered Marie in the garage as she folded laundry. His voice was low and menacing, his words laced with threats. When he grabbed her arm, she managed to wrench free and run to her room, locking the door behind her. She didn't sleep that night. She lay in the dark, her heart racing, her mind swirling with fear and anger. For the first time, she started to think about fighting back. Marie's fear began to transform into something else, rage. She couldn't keep living this way, constantly on edge, waiting for the next time Richard would corner her. She felt like a prisoner in her own home, and the weight of that realization was unbearable. For the first time, she considered what it might take to stop him. Her thoughts grew darker with each passing day. She started researching self-defense methods late at night, her laptop screen casting an eerie glow in her room. She watched videos on how to fend off an attacker, how to use household items as weapons, and even how to handle a knife. She didn't want to think about using violence, but the reality of her situation left her feeling like she had no choice. She began carrying a small kitchen knife with her, hiding it in her pocket whenever she was alone with Richard. The feel of the cold metal gave her a strange sense of comfort. It was a reminder that she wasn't completely powerless, that she could protect herself if she had to. But even with the knife, her fear never truly left her. One night, while everyone else was asleep, Marie crept into the kitchen. She stared at the block of knives on the counter, her fingers hovering over the largest blade. She picked it up, feeling its weight, imagining what it would take to use it. Her hands trembled as she placed it back, horrified by her own thoughts. But the image stayed with her, haunting her in the quiet moments when she was alone. The tension in the house reached a breaking point when Richard tried to force his way into her room one evening. She had been listening to music with her door locked, trying to drown out the world, when she heard him banging on the door. His voice was slurred, his words threatening. She held the knife tightly in her hand, her heart pounding as she pressed her back against the door to keep him out. Eventually he gave up, muttering something under his breath as he stumbled away. That night, something shifted inside Marie. She realized she couldn't wait for someone to save her. No one was coming, not her mother, not the police, not her friends. She was completely alone, and if she didn't act, Richard would only grow more dangerous. She started preparing herself mentally for the possibility of a confrontation. She thought about what she would do if Richard tried to hurt her again, rehearsing scenarios in her mind. Her journal became more frantic, filled with angry, desperate entries about wanting to take back control of her life. As the days passed, the line between fear and anger blurred. Marie wasn't sure who she was becoming, but she knew one thing. She couldn't live like this any longer. Something had to change, and she was determined to be the one to make it happen. The night of the confrontation was quiet, almost unnaturally so. Diane was working another late shift, leaving Marie alone in the house with Richard. She had spent the day in a state of heightened anxiety, her nerves raw from the anticipation of what might happen. She tried to focus on her schoolwork, but every noise in the house made her flinch. Richard had been drinking since the evening, and by the time the clock struck 9, Marie could hear his heavy footsteps moving around the living room. The faint sound of the TV played in the background, but it did little to mask the tension in the air. Marie stayed in her room, the knife hidden under her pillow, her heart pounding with each passing minute. It was close to midnight when she heard the footsteps grow louder, moving toward her room. She froze, her breath caught in her throat. The handle of her bedroom door rattled, followed by a soft knock. "Marie," Richard called out, his voice slurred but menacing. "We need to talk." Marie didn't respond, hoping he would go away. But the knocking grew louder, more insistent. She reached under her pillow and gripped the knife tightly, her hands trembling. When Richard opened the door and stepped inside, Marie felt a surge of panic. He stood there, his expression dark, and took a step toward her. She held the knife out in front of her, her voice shaking as she told him to leave. Richard laughed, a cold, mocking sound that sent chills down her spine. "You think you can scare me with that?" he said, taking another step closer. What happened next felt like a blur. Richard lunged toward her, and Marie reacted on instinct. She closed her eyes and swung the knife, feeling it connect with something solid. When she opened her eyes, she saw Richard clutching his side, blood seeping through his fingers. He staggered backward, collapsing onto the floor. For a moment, there was only silence. Marie stared at him, her mind struggling to process what she had just done. Her hands were covered in blood, the knife still clutched tightly in her grip. Panic set in as she realized the gravity of the situation. She grabbed her phone and called 911, her voice shaking as she explained what had happened. The operator stayed on the line with her until the police arrived, but Marie barely registered their words. All she could think about was the blood on her hands and the lifeless body on the floor. When the police arrived, they found Marie sitting on the floor, still holding the knife. They arrested her on the spot, handcuffing her and leading her out of the house. Diane arrived shortly after, screaming at Marie as the police escorted her into the back of a squad car. Marie didn't say a word, her mind consumed by the events of the night. The investigation that followed was long and grueling. Marie was charged with second-degree murder, and the media quickly latched onto the case, painting her as a troubled teenager who had snapped. Her journal was discovered during the investigation, and while it provided a detailed account of Richard's behavior, it also became a double-edged sword. Prosecutors used it to argue that Marie had planned the attack, pointing to her descriptions of feeling trapped and her growing anger. Diane's testimony against her daughter was devastating. She told the court that Marie had always been dramatic and prone to exaggeration. She dismissed the claims of abuse, insisting that Richard was a good man who had only tried to help Marie. Her words carried weight, and the jury seemed swayed by her unwavering stance. Marie's defense team worked tirelessly to prove her claims, calling witnesses who could speak to her character. Her friends and teachers described her as hardworking and kind, but their words weren't enough to counter the narrative the prosecution had built. The town was divided, with some people believing Marie and others siding with Diane. The trial lasted for months, each day more draining than the last. Marie sat quietly in the courtroom, her face pale and expressionless. She knew the odds were stacked against her, but she couldn't shake the hope that someone would believe her. In the end, the jury found her guilty of second-degree murder. She was sentenced to 15 years in prison, a verdict that left her supporters in shock. As the judge read the sentence, Marie felt a strange sense of numbness. She had expected this outcome, but hearing it out loud made it all the more real. Diane never visited her in prison. Marie later learned through a family friend that Diane had moved to another state, leaving behind the house and any connection to her daughter. The betrayal stung, but Marie tried to focus on surviving her new reality. Years later, a startling discovery came to light. Diane passed away unexpectedly, and while sorting through her belongings, police found letters Richard had written to a friend. In those letters, he bragged about his behavior toward Marie, describing his advances in sickening detail. The evidence confirmed Marie's claims, but it was too late to change anything. The discovery brought a bittersweet sense of vindication. The world finally knew the truth, but it didn't erase the years Marie had lost, or the pain she had endured. She remained behind bars, a tragic figure in a story of fear, silence, and a system that had failed her. The scars of that night would stay with her forever, a reminder of how desperation and injustice could twist lives beyond recognition.